Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be diving in.
So today we're looking at something really quite fascinating. Some potentially surprising developments, actually, concerning faith in the Muslim world.
That's right. We've got some sources, shared by a listener actually, that paint a picture of Muslim-Christian interactions that might challenge, common assumptions.
Yeah, forget the sort of standard narratives, maybe. We're aiming to explore something, well, a bit more nuanced, maybe unexpected.
Exactly. We've looked at these reports, observations, particularly focusing on what they describe as significant growth in Christian communities within various Muslim majority areas.
Right. These sources seem to suggest a noticeable rise in people moving from Islam to Christianity, particularly over the last few decades.
That's the core claim.
Okay. And our goal today, listener, is really just to understand what's being reported here. We want to look into this supposed increase, the scale of it, and what factors the sources say are driving it.
And it's important, as you said, we're exploring the content of these sources, not endorsing any specific religious view, just understanding the information presented.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's unpack this. What's the kind of headline claim from these sources about the sheer scale of these changes?
Well, the central assertion, and it's a big one, is that more people from a Muslim background have embraced Christianity in, say, the last 20 years than in any other similar period in history.
That is a huge claim.
It is a very bold claim. And the sources, they do offer specific examples to back this up.
And these aren't just vague statements, right? They mention actual numbers, which, if they're accurate, point to a pretty substantial trend. What are some examples they give?
Okay, so they highlight several regions. In North Africa, reports mention over 16,000 Berbers becoming Christian over the last couple of decades.
16,000.
Yeah. Then in Central Asia, specifically Kazakhstan, they talk about a church planting movement leading to 13,000 Kazakh conversions over about 15 years. And then there's Kashmir. The claim there is up to 12,000 Kashmiri Muslims turning from what the source calls jihad to a path of peace rooted in Christian faith.
Wow. Okay. And wasn't there an even larger example mentioned? This place called Jedidistan?
Yes, Jedidistan. It's an unnamed Asian Muslim country in the source, but the figures are striking. Over 150,000 Muslims reportedly identifying as Christian, forming more than 3,000 local groups, these Isa Jamaats, or Jesus groups.
150,000. Okay. If you take those numbers, as reported in the source material, it's a significant shift they're describing.
Undeniably, it paints a picture of considerable religious change.
Okay, so that sets the stage in terms of scale, this claim of widespread, significant conversion. Now, the sources also try to explain why this might be happening, especially given the, let's say, historical context between Islam and Christianity. They talk a lot about Shariah law. What's the connection they're making?
Right. The argument presented in the source is that Islam, through Shariah, its system of laws and social principles, historically acted as a very effective barrier against Christian influence. It's framed as a system that actively limited and in some places even sought to eliminate Christian presence where it had previously been strong.
And they get quite specific about how Shariah supposedly did this, how it historically hindered Christian growth and, maybe more pointedly, made it difficult for people to leave Islam. What mechanisms do they highlight?
Well, several key things. First, the prohibition on Muslims converting to other faiths. This, under traditional interpretations of Sharia, often carries the death penalty.
The death penalty, wow.
And conversely, Christians were generally forbidden from actively trying to convert Muslims. Their own practice, even for established communities, was often restricted. Evangelism, if allowed at all, might be confined just to church grounds.
So not exactly a level playing field for sharing beliefs.
Not according to this source, no. They point out a disparity. For instance, a Christian criticizing the Prophet or key Islamic tenets could face death, while at the same time, sermons in mosques might openly critique Christian doctrines like the Trinity or the divinity of Christ. So a real power imbalance in religious speech.
And then there are the rules around family life.
Yeah.
Marriage and children.
Exactly. That's another crucial area. A Muslim man could marry a Christian woman. She could keep her faith, theoretically, but the children, automatically Muslim.
Oh, okay.
And in divorce, custody typically went to the Muslim father. Now, flip that. For a Christian man to marry a Muslim woman, he'd generally have to convert to Islam first.
And couldn't convert back.
Trying to revert back to Christianity after converting to Islam. That, again, carried the death penalty under Sharia. So you see how these laws would strongly encourage staying within or converting to Islam while making leaving incredibly risky.
Yeah, it creates a very strong current in one direction.
Yeah,
Did the source mention other sort of historical incentives?
it did. Socioeconomic ones, too. Historically, non-Muslims, the dhimmis, often couldn't serve in the military and had to pay a special tax, the jizya, for protection.
Right.
Converting to Islam removed that tax burden and opened up military careers. So the picture painted is one where historically there were many pathways into Islam, facilitated by law and social structure, and very few very dangerous paths out.
It sounds like a really comprehensive system of influence described in the source. But interestingly, they don't just point outwards. They also look at factors within historical Christianity that they argue might have made it, well, vulnerable to Islamic expansion. What were those?
Yeah, that's an interesting angle. The source suggests that as Christianity gained wealth, built grand cathedrals, used elaborate icons, sometimes prophetic voices within the church questioning this materialism were suppressed, even called heretics.
So a potential disconnect between, say, outward displays and maybe inner spiritual vitality.
That seems to be the implication. They also talk about political interference. Byzantine rulers, for instance, are described as sometimes discouraging local leadership or Bible translations into common languages, seeing them perhaps as threats to imperial control.
Which would make faith less accessible to ordinary people.
Potentially, yes. And linked to that, the appointment of church leaders. According to the source, positions were sometimes given based on political loyalty, not piety. And they claim this showed during the Arab conquests in North Africa, suggesting some European clergy fled, abandoning their flocks. There's even a specific, quite startling account of an Egyptian Christian official supposedly helping Muslim forces enter Alexandria, seeing them as liberators from Byzantine oppression.
That's a perspective you don't often hear. Complex local dynamics, it seems. And they mentioned slavery, too.
Yes. This is presented as another vulnerability. Shariah prohibited Muslims from being enslaved by Christians. So for someone already enslaved under Christian rule, converting to Islam could be a pathway to freedom. The source argues this contributed to conversions and even grassroots support for the advancing Islamic rule in some places.
So a real mix of external pressures and internal weaknesses, as described by the source, shaping that history. But things are different now, they argue. What are the key shifts in the modern era that the source points to?
Well, they suggest many of those historical factors just aren't as powerful today. Obviously, slavery is largely abolished. Church-state relations are vastly different in most places. And those specific legal incentives around marriage, while maybe still present in some contexts, aren't as universally or rigidly applied.
And crucially, information flows differently now, right? It's much harder to control.
Massively so. Satellite TV, the internet, it's just incredibly difficult for any system, legal or otherwise, to completely block access to alternative viewpoints, including Christian messages or just diverse perspectives within society.
Globalization, too, presumably. More contact between people.
Definitely. Increased travel, migration, communication, it all leads to more interaction between Christians and Muslims.
Though the source does note it's not just a one-way street.
No, interestingly, they observe that while some people from, say, secular Western backgrounds might find answers in Islam, you also have this concurrent, significant movement towards Christianity from within Muslim communities that we're discussing.
But the challenges haven't vanished entirely.
Oh, absolutely not. The source is clear. Sharia, whether as state law or powerful social custom, is still very real in many places, and converts from Islam can face huge risks, persecution, ostracism, even violence or death in some regions.
Which means discretion is often necessary.
Yes, the source implies that's why details about identities and specific locations of believers are often kept confidential. The danger is real.
Okay, so that gives us the big picture, the historical context, and the modern shifts. Now let's zoom in on those specific examples the sources provide. North Africa first, the Berber people. What's the story there?
Right, the Berbers. The source connects the large number of conversions, that figure of over 16,000 in 2 decades, partly to the impact of long-running civil conflict in the region. It suggests this instability might have weakened the grip of traditional Sharia enforcement. The source even quotes someone saying, basically, because we can.
Implying a sort of opening created by unrest.
That seems to be the idea, a window of opportunity, perhaps. But other factors are highlighted too, particularly around identity.
How so?
There's been a rise in Berber ethnic consciousness, a strengthening of their distinct identity, and the Christian message, crucially, seems to have resonated when presented in their own language.
Language resources were key.
Very key, according to the source. They point to three main things: a new Berber translation of the New Testament, gospel radio programs in Berber, and the Jesus film, also in Berber. They estimate that film alone reached maybe 4 million people.
4 million. That's incredible reach. And it wasn't driven by outsiders.
No, and this is emphasized. The outreach was reportedly led primarily by Berber Christians themselves, working with a missionary strategist, but not dependent on a large foreign missionary presence. Indigenous leadership seems central.
Okay. Now, shifting context completely, Kashmir, a place marked by such long-term conflict. How does the source link that situation to changes in faith?
Well, with the decades of violence, over 35,000 lives lost since '89 alone, the source suggests this has led many Kashmiris to, well, question things, to seek alternatives, perhaps peace. And they mention this reported shift from jihad to Jesus, and note that even some Indian newspapers back in 2003 were sounding the alarm about rising Christian numbers.
So profound social trauma potentially leading to spiritual searching.
That appears to be the connection drawn. And again, local converts, people from Muslim backgrounds who's embraced Christianity, are described as being active, despite facing really severe consequences.
Yeah, the risks sound immense. They mention a pastor.
Pastor Jonathan Pelger. His church reportedly burned down multiple times. He speaks of thousands interested, but living under constant threat, facing social boycotts. And tragically, a worker with Gospel for Asia was murdered there in 2002.
It really brings home the human cost. There was a story about a young woman, too, Masuda.
Yes. She identifies as a believer in Christ, talks about experiencing visions, but she's terrified to declare it publicly. Fear for herself, fear for her family. It just highlights that intense pressure cooker environment.
And the reasons people are converting, despite the risks. What did the source suggest there? Someone named Premi Gurgen.
Right. Gurgen is quoted suggesting that the experience of militancy itself leads some to question, to search, and perhaps a perception, rightly or wrongly, of no forgiveness within the Islam they knew. Pastor Pelger, meanwhile, emphasizes their approach isn't pressure, but sharing biblical stories of love, harmony, tolerance.
Finding resonance there. And the numbers, while hard to pin down.
Estimates mentioned go up to maybe 12,000 converts. Hard to verify, but that's the figure cited.
Okay, let's move to Central Asia now, Kazakhstan specifically. Post-Soviet era, different dynamics again.
Very different. After the Soviet Union collapsed in '89, religious freedom opened up. But initially, there were very few Christians among the Turkic peoples, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks. There was historical baggage, tension between them and Slavic Christians or Russian atheists.
Were there German communities there?
Yes, ethnic German Protestants had churches established during Soviet times, but they hadn't really connected much with the surrounding Turkic Muslim population. As many of those Germans later emigrated, a space opened up.
And indigenous churches started to grow.
Exactly. Local Turkic churches, led by Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks themselves, began to emerge and multiply. Kazakhstan is highlighted for significant growth, over 13,000 Kazakh conversions mentioned in about 15 years, leading to over 300 indigenous Kazakh churches led by Kazakh pastors. Some wider estimates for the republic go as high as 50,000 believers.
The source mentioned a specific strategy, a people group approach. What did that mean in this context?
It's a mission strategy that focuses on specific ethnic or cultural groups. Here, it meant engaging directly with Central Asian peoples, understanding their unique history, especially regarding Slavic influence, and not trying to work primarily through existing Slavic churches.
Building direct relationships.
Yes. And this seemed to tap into a rising sense of Kazakh national pride post-independence. There's an anecdote about the Kazakh Minister of Education preferring an American initiative that engaged directly, rather than Ivy League universities working via Moscow. It suggests a desire for culturally respectful partnership.
And again, like North Africa, local language resources were vital.
Absolutely crucial. Bible translations, the Jesus film in local Turkic languages, these were key tools. But the emphasis was always on empowering local leaders, stimulating movements led by Kazakh for Kazakhs.
Okay. Finally, this brings us to Jedidistan, the unnamed Asian country with the largest reported movement. The details here, especially the personal story of Sharif, sound really central.
Sharif's story is powerful and seems foundational. Kicked out of his religious school for asking too many questions, shunned by his family. Then he meets a missionary, Tom, gets a New Testament in his own Jedidai language.
And that led to his conversion.
Yes, specifically reading John 3:17, source says. But then came persecution, beatings, having to flee his hometown. It's a dramatic start.
But he eventually went back.
Yeah,
And connected with a friend.
he did. Years later, he returned and reconnected with his childhood friend, Bilal. Bilal saw the change in Sharif. And then, after Sharif was badly beaten because of his faith, Bilal himself declared he believed. That partnership, starting around 1991, is presented as the catalyst for this huge movement.
And the reported growth is just staggering. Nearly 4,000 churches, over 150,000 converts in a little more than a decade.
That's the claim. And interestingly, Sharif himself is said to have only personally baptized 2 people.
Just 2? Who?
Bilal, his friend, and later his own father. It really underscores the idea of this being a relational, multiplying movement, not centered on one charismatic figure baptizing masses.
Despite incredible opposition.
Intense opposition, beatings, death threats, and then, tragically, Bilal was murdered in 2003, yet the movement apparently kept growing.
The source mentioned a Western coordinator playing a supportive role.
Yes, someone providing encouragement, resources, maybe some safety advice, research, helping Sharif think strategically about expanding the reach. Apparently, Sharif also taught this coordinator how to use the Quran as a bridge when talking about Jesus, showing that cultural sensitivity again.
And there was some external research that seemed to support the scale of this.
In 2002, a team from the International Mission Board investigated. They reported finding significant numbers of baptisms and believers in the networks linked to both Sharif and the coordinator. They confirmed rapid growth, thousands of these small churches, these Isa Jamaats, though they did note a shortage of trained local leaders.
Tell us more about these Isa Jamaats. They sound like they blend traditions.
They do seem highly contextualized. They meet on Fridays, the main day of worship in Jedidistan. They call their groups Jesus groups, Isa Jamaats, leaders, imams. New believers are Izahi, belonging to Jesus.
So using familiar terms.
Exactly. The meetings are small, usually in homes, maybe 30 people, 3 families. Men and women are present, often sitting separately. They practice loud, simultaneous prayer. They tithe for ministry and more church planting. They sing local indigenous songs and poems about their faith based on scripture. Leadership rotates among lay members for Bible messages.
That sounds very organic and effective. The source mentioned low dropout rates.
Yeah, a low apostasy rate is reported. And interestingly, an awareness among believers that they need to be careful not to just mix old Islamic ideas with their new Christian faith without thinking it through. That self-awareness is seen positively.
Meeting in homes probably helps with safety too.
Likely provides some cover, yes, but also fosters that close-knit community feel. But they're described as openly professing faith despite the risks.
There was a story about an imam.
Yes, a public imam who reportedly stood up and rejected the Quran, declaring his faith in Christ. A very bold, very dangerous move, highlighting the depth of questioning happening.
So, boiling it down for Jedidistan, the key factors according to the source.
A culturally sensitive Bible translation, meeting in homes, using familiar Muslim-friendly terms, using the Quran itself as a starting point for discussion, and critically, the powerful witness of converts facing persecution.
Like Mishanur, the first martyr mentioned.
Exactly. His story is incredible. Tortured, refusing to deny his faith, ultimately killed. But the source claims his killers were so impacted, they later sought forgiveness from his family and became believers themselves.
Wow. That's quite a story.
It speaks volumes about the impact of that kind of costly witness.
And the researchers back in 2002 foresaw risks to Sharif and Bilal.
They did. They noted the danger they were in. But even after Bilal's murder, the movement's resilience is highlighted, reaching that 150,000 figure afterwards.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what are the main threads, the key takeaways from all this information presented in the sources?
Well, the sources clearly argue that there are significant dynamic movements towards Christianity happening within various Muslim contexts around the world. These aren't happening in a vacuum. They're set against a backdrop of complex history, ongoing challenges, often severe risks.
And driven by a mix of factors.
A real interplay, it seems. Things like culturally relevant communication language, familiar forms, the importance of local indigenous leadership, and perhaps most powerfully, the sheer resilience and bold witness of converts themselves, often in the face of persecution.
And we need to stress again, this exploration is based entirely on the material shared with us by a listener.
Yeah.
We're reporting on the content of those sources, not validating them or adopting any religious stance ourselves.
Absolutely. The goal was simply to understand the picture painted by these specific reports and observations. what claims are being made, and what reasons are given.
Right, so for you, the listener, as you think about these stories, this complex dance of faith, identity, culture, risk, and change across these diverse settings, what does it prompt you to consider about the nature of belief itself, about how societies shift, and maybe what further questions does this raise for you? Something to ponder.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.